When it comes to Japanese battleships, the Fuso class is often overlooked, reduced to a one-note meme about their admittedly massive pagoda mast, largely because these ships were kept away from combat for the vast majority of their service. They came too late for the Great War, and they were outdated for the Pacific War. As a result, Fuso and Yamashiro's baptism of fire would also be their swan song, the Battle of Surigao Strait, where these old battleships met their end, against American torpedoes and the ghosts of Pearl Harbor. Of course, that does come later. First, let's touch on where Fuso began. This is a story that goes hand in hand with that of the 8-8 fleet. 8 modern battleships and 8 large armored cruisers, the cornerstone of Japanese defense policy. In 1910, the Japanese Navy tried to push through a crash modernization program to finish the 8-8 fleet in one go and leapfrog potential enemies. It was an ambitious request, to say the least. Too ambitious for the Japanese government. The Japanese Diet, their parliament, refused outright on economic grounds. The Navy would just have to settle with a less ambitious construction program. In this case, 4 battle cruisers and a single battleship. The battle cruisers would become the Congos. As for the battleship, that would become Fuso. If you're curious on more of this background, I'd be happy to do a video dedicated to Fuso's development history. Let me know in the comments. For now, let's move on. This was a battleship designed for one thing, and one thing above all others: to be superior to any hypothetical enemy warship, in particular the new American dreadnoughts. At this point, that meant the New York class with their 10 14-inch 356mm guns. To be superior to that, the Japanese opted for the prototypical turret farm. 12 14-inch guns and no fewer than 6 twin turrets. This was an extra pair of guns over New York, which admittedly wasn't a massive increase. Nonetheless, it was still an increase, even if the layout was a bit inefficient. It would also cause issues in service. The amidships turrets tended to have heating issues. Being placed around the power plant meant the powder in the magazines was held at a higher temperature, no matter the efforts to cool it. It wasn't a fire hazard, not really, but different powder temperatures could result in different performance, which can be an issue in salvo fire when you're tracking the fall of your shot. The ships were also longer than necessary and had restricted firing arcs for the amidships pair of turrets. This was something the Japanese were willing to accept, with Conway even noting they had access to Vickers' research on triple turrets. The Japanese considered the 6 twins better for offensive action, most likely for engaging multiple targets at once. As such, they went for the turret farm. Either way, that wraps up the background. I'll briefly touch on the design notes and then move into service history. For this section, we'll start with the displacement. As designed, Fuso would displace 29,326 tons at the standard loading, going up to 35,900 when fully loaded, something driven mostly by the need to fit the 12 356mm guns in their 6 twin turrets. 2 carried in a super-firing pair on the bow, while the third was between the 2 funnels, and the fourth was behind the aft funnel, while the final 2 were in a super-firing pair on the stern. This heavy broadside was supported in turn by a heavy secondary battery, 16 6-inch 152mm guns in single casement mountings, with offensive weaponry rounded off by the typically Japanese torpedo battery, 6 submerged tubes with 3 on either broadside. For defense, on the other hand, the ship had heavy armor protection. The main belt was 305 millimeters, 12 inches at its thickest, with a 4-inch 102 millimeter belt beneath it, while the deck armor for its part came out to 32 to 51 millimeters, or 1.3 to 2 inches. With all of this capable of 23 knots on 40,000 shaft horsepower, actually quite speedy for the time. And also where we can wrap up the long background and move to service history, which will start out quite quiet, as you could expect from what I said at the start of the video. In any event, Fuso's story began on March 11th, 1912. She was laid down in the Kure Naval Arsenal, where construction went at an average pace for the day. The ship would take a little over 2 years to launch, with this coming on March 28th of 1914, with the commissioning following on November 8th, 1915, at which point Fuso spent about a month working up, among other things, transporting the new emperor, Taisho or Yoshihito, around. Specifically, Fuso dropped him off at Yokohama during a massive naval review on December 4th, 1915, after which Fuso would enter proper service, assigned to the 1st Battleship Division on December 13th, 1915. Although proper service in this case remained largely uneventful. While the Great War was going on, Japan had little to do by this point. The Central Powers had been booted from Asia, and Fuso would spend her time on training and patrol duty. When the First World War came to an end in 1918, not much would change either. Fuso continued to spend her time on peacetime work for the entirety of the 1920s, with the most excitement during that period being the Great Kanto earthquake on September 1st, 1923, where Fuso would provide relief support in Tokyo Bay for much of September. Beyond this, there wasn't much of note, outside of the refits, which were largely of the routine overhaul variety. There were changes, of course. The main battery elevation was increased in 1923, and the ship gained a kite balloon for gunnery spotting. While in 1925, she began to develop the pagoda mast. However, it wouldn't be until 1930 that the ship saw her major modernization. Well, the first one. That began on April 19th, 1930, and would run through May 12th, 1933. That long period should tell you how extensive it really was. For example, the power plant was torn out. The old coal-fired boilers were replaced by oil-fired models. 24 coal boilers replaced by just 6 oil-fired boilers. Nonetheless, this resulted in an increase to 75,000 shaft horsepower. The speed, well, I'll get back to that in a bit. This reduction in boilers allowed the Japanese to remove the forward funnel, which also let them flip the third turret to face toward the bow, gaining better firing arcs in the process, which is, incidentally, how you can tell her apart from Yamashiro in post-refit photos. That and a slightly different style of pagoda mast, which was built up during this rebuild, becoming the unruly mess that, let's be honest, we all know and love. A massive 40-meter, 130 feet tall monstrosity, done largely to fit more control platforms, compass platforms, and general control areas. I've yet to find a comprehensive blueprint noting everything stuffed in there, but that's the gist. If there ever was such a blueprint, and I'm not saying there was, it was likely lost in the general destruction of records during the war. Meanwhile, the aft mast was also reworked, becoming a squat affair with room for two twin 5-inch 127mm gun mounts, 4 barrels in all, to support another pair of twin mounts next to the forward superstructure, leaving the ship with 8 5-inch guns in all. Armor protection would also be improved. Not the belt, which remained the same, but the deck, which became a maximum of 4.5 inches. Not the thickest out there, but for what was an early 1910s design, not exactly bad either. With the ship also gaining the obligatory anti-torpedo bulkheads, which necessitated the removal of the torpedo tubes. Either way, that wraps up the initial rebuild, though realistically, there isn't much reason to consider the 2 first rebuilds as distinct work. They are, of course, but only just. Fuso returned to service in May 1933, only to be right back into dock on September 16, 1934. She spent a bit over a year in the initial rebuild state, while the second rebuild, running until March 1935, saw a large change to the ship. The stern was lengthened by 25 feet, akin to the similar work done on the Congos. This, in addition to new props and rudders, kept Fuso capable of around 24 knots on the 75,000 shaft horsepower, despite the torpedo bulges also being extended further up, and the displacement going up to just under 40,000 tons when at the deep load. Regardless, that wraps up the major modernization, with the exception of some work from February 1937 to March 1938, which saw 2 of the 6-inch guns removed while the first 25mm guns were fitted, and the most noteworthy work coming in reinforcements to the stern and the addition of more fire control equipment, on top of the stern being modified again at the end of 1939, when Fuso's aircraft equipment, catapults, and cranes were moved back there, with this finishing off the major work. Though there is a note here. Combined Fleet cites this on December 15, 1939. Anatomy of the ship counters with December 15, 1940. Make of that what you will. Either way, with this in mind, let's focus on service again, which would be more or less the same. Shocking, I know. The 1930s, outside the major rebuilds, was spent largely on training and patrol. While Fuso would serve off the Chinese coast, she didn't contribute much to the Sino-Japanese War, with the ship more or less on second-line duty by the time the 1940s rolled around, depending on which date you take for the final modernization. And even in the 1940s, she would continue to remain on second-line work, including during the attack on Pearl Harbor. This would see Fuso in the home islands in December 1941, with the ship leaving on December 8th to sail for the Bonin Islands alongside Nagato, Mutsu, and Hosho. Not for direct combat, but as a mobile reserve should that be needed. As it was not, Fuso would be back in Japan by December 13th, where the ship, alongside Yamashiro, remained for the early parts of the war. It's telling, perhaps, that the Japanese didn't consider them necessary for the rampage through the South Pacific. In any event, Fuso would remain in the Japanese home islands. There were a couple scares, with the first coming in February 1942. Signal traffic indicated an American carrier strike, so Fuso was assigned as part of a fleet to intercept this in the Bonans. That came to nothing and would be canceled. Similarly, a false aircraft sighting on March 12th saw a patrol off Wake Island, which was recalled on March 15th. Fuso's first potential taste of combat as a result came with the Doolittle raid. On April 18, 1942, she was sent out in pursuit of Admiral Halsey's ships. As I noted in the Yamashiro video, this was perhaps a bit hopeful. Fuso was never catching up to fast carriers, so the ships returned home on April 20th, with the rest of 1942 following a similar pattern. Fuso mostly stuck close to home, where she would help escort Hyuga on May 5th after her 5th turret blew up. And then later that month, she would sail on May 29th for the Battle of Midway. Well, I say for the Battle of Midway, but that's not quite correct. Fuso was actually part of a reserve force to support the Aleutians campaign should that be necessary. And Fuso would support those operations from June 6th through June 17th, 1942. Though this didn't amount to much in the grand scheme of things for the battleship. In fact, for the rest of the year, Fuso wouldn't get up to much. She stuck close to home into 1943, where an abortive plan was made to convert her to a battle carrier. However, mostly in light of Hyuga's wrecked turret, that plan would be swapped to the Issei's instead, resulting in Fuso being relegated to training for 1942 and 1943, during which she would be moored in dock on June 8th when Mutsu suffered her catastrophic explosion. Fuso picked up 353 survivors from Mutsu and would be the base for the investigation into the sinking. Because of this, it was only in August 1943 that she would leave Japan for a transport run to Truk, where Fuso would remain through February 1944, with the only real break being another failed attempt to catch American carriers in October 1943, following which nothing much happened until she left Truk on February 1st, 1944, narrowly avoiding Operation Hailstone as a result, with the battleship sailing not to Japan but to Singapore instead. She would arrive on February 21st and remain through May of 1944. Because of this, Fuso would miss the combat raging in the Central Pacific, with the ship only leaving her new home on May 11th to take up shop in the Philippines instead. While there, Fuso would provide support on a transport run at the end of May, where she would be stalked but not engaged by multiple American submarines. After this was done, nothing major would happen for Fuso for the rest of summer 1944, with the exception of a submarine attack on July 14th, which failed to land any hits. A similar attack on September 21st also failed to hit. at which point Fuso has done relatively little actual combat. However, with the Japanese growing ever more desperate, this would change soon enough. Being based in the South Pacific, Fuso and Yamashiro were assigned to the Southern Force for Japan's final throw of the dice, what became the Battle of Leyte Gulf in late October 1944. This would see Fuso set sail on October 22nd for her final sortie. The battleship set off for Surigao Strait to try and pincer the American landings at Leyte from the south. Unfortunately for Fuso, this would not go well. On October 24th, she was bombed by American carrier aircraft from Enterprise. A hit to the fantail wrecked the floatplanes and caused minor damage to the steering room. More damage came from detonating depth charges, though only 10 of the crew were lost. A second hit to the forward secondary battery wiped out that battery's crew. Still, Fuso chugged along, even if she did accidentally fire on Mogami, contributing to that ship's poor luck. Regardless, as night fell on October 24th, the Southern Force entered Surigao proper. Here, the Japanese would sail into an American ambush. PT boats and destroyers launched waves of torpedo attacks on the lumbering Japanese formation, with Fuso being hit around 3 a.m. on October 25, 1944, probably by USS Melvin. Regardless of where the torpedoes originated, the ship was hit by two. Fuso was struck near the number 1 turret and a boiler room, causing the ship to slow and list to starboard. That list would eventually force the crew to abandon ship around 3:30, with Fuso rolling to starboard and sinking around 3:40 to 3:50, at which point you got the reports that the ship had broken in two, with the two halves remaining afloat and burning for an hour. This did not happen. Her sinking location was marked by oil fire, but Fuso went down in one piece. The crew from Petrel found her wreck on November 25th, 2017, in one piece, admittedly broken amidships from the impact with the bottom, but otherwise intact. Part of this confusion probably stems from the fact that only 10 of the crew survived. Some might have been picked up by Asagumo, but she was lost later that night, and any that made it ashore were likely killed. Regardless, this is where Fuso's story came to an end. A sad story when you really think about it, I think. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.